Hello and welcome to lesson number 16. This is the final video in our series, and you're currently taking a look at snapshot number 9. And so we want to review what took place over the past hour and a half of development or so. So the first thing I want to talk about is code cleanliness or organizing your code. And so if we take a look at the code behind in the main form.cs, you can see that, for example, in line 18, I have the private toolstrip button events comment, and then you'll begin to see all of the event handlers for the toolstrip buttons. If we scroll down to line number 64, you can see I have a comment there, menu item events. So I've organized all of the menu items together, and you can see in line 107 the main event handlers and like the main form.load, folder combo box, selected index change, and so on are all organized together. Then line 148, you can see the helper methods are all kind of organized together as well. Now, in the Visual Basic version of this video, what I've done was use regions to kind of roll up all of these similar methods together. However, in C#, the region doesn't exactly work the same way. You can't put it inside of a class and expect the results to be the same as they are in Visual Basic. However, I'm still able to accomplish something similar to organize my code through using the comments. Now, why go to all the work of organizing your code and collecting them, similar events and methods together? It's really something you do to help yourself in the future. So 3 days, 5 days from now, when I look at the code again, it's easy for me to find what I'm looking for. One of the frustrations that you begin to have as you add a significant amount of code to your project is finding things. And so you can cut down on some of that frustration by just taking a few minutes when you need a mental break to copy and paste your methods and kind of organize them in some way. Now, some people organize all of their methods alphabetically. I choose to try to organize the methods in some type of a logical container. Any way you do it is fine. Some people have strong opinions about it, but just find a way that works for you and then continue to do that in all of your projects. It also helps other people who will take a look at your code to kind of see that there's a pattern and they can begin to expect certain things as they review your code. So as you become more of a professional code developer, code cleanliness and organization of the code is very important. On a slightly related topic, you'll notice that I have created a series of helper methods where formerly all the code existed to, for example, add a folder tool strip, or I'm sorry, add a folder, or delete a folder, or edit a folder to call up those dialogues. So what did I do? I basically took all that code out and I refactored it into its own method. So if you were to double click on the add folder so that the entire word is highlighted, right click it and then select go to definition, you can see in line 150 and following all of the helper methods that will, for example, add a folder, or in the other cases, edit and delete folders. So I've just moved this code. Now, why did I do that? The reason is because I anticipate in the future adding some functionality to the menu item and possibly even adding some contextual menus and maybe some other shortcuts that may also allow the user to easily add a folder. And I don't want to just copy and paste all this code in lines 152 through the end of this method here in line 1 or 200 rather. I don't want to just copy and paste that into, for example, a menu click event and then a context menu click event. There's an old adage in software development that says you should never write the same code twice. And so we're trying to strive to create one method that encapsulates this functionality, then call that method everywhere we need to add a folder. So this is closely related to code organization, making sure your code makes sense. As you're combing through your code, looking for opportunities to refactor it in such a way that it's more readable and that's more concise. Okay. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the strategy that I use for fortifying the code within my application. And we've already talked about declarative exception handling in lesson number 11, specifically how to use the try-catch statement in order to make sure that our applications don't just blow up whenever they encounter a problem. So as you can see from the add folder method in line number 150, This is the method that we've implemented to pop open the folder dialog, allowing the user to either create or edit a folder name. And you can see that in line number 165 and 167 that we retrieve the result, whether the user clicked on the OK button or the cancel button. And then based on that, we're going to, if they clicked OK, we're going to add a new folder row to the data set, which in turn will update the underlying data source. Okay. So you can see that there are some potential problems here. The first potential problem is in line 172, where we're setting the folder name equal to whatever the user typed in the folder dialog in the folder name text box. Now, you're not going to really see an exception occur here, probably, unless there's some type problem of some nature. What you will see that manifested in, though, is in line 174, 176. So if the user typed in too many characters for the amount of space that we've allocated in the database, we might encounter an exception there, or too few values. And so when we go to actually add that folder row to our data set, we might encounter a problem. Or more likely in line 176, whenever the update method is called of our folder table adapter, we might have a problem then. What kind of problems can occur? Well, the first one would be a folder row that just doesn't match up with the underlying database. Maybe the user went in and was playing around with the RSS dataset.xsd, or maybe they went to the database and they were making changes to the folder table, or maybe they've opened up the rss.mdf file in another application, creating a lock on that file so that we can't insert a record, or any number of potential problems. So whenever those occur, we don't want the application just simply to blow up. We want to be able to exit gracefully. So what we've done is implement the catch statement in lines 189 through 192. You can see that we're popping open a message box that says, hey, there's a problem creating a new folder, and then we use the message property of the exception to give them the full text of the problem that was encountered. Now, you may want to rethink that. Maybe it's not a good idea to tell the user everything, but this would be a problem that's fairly unexpected. So perhaps we can give them some clues to what the problem is. Maybe they can say, oh yeah, I didn't realize I had another application open that might be creating a lock on the database, and maybe they can self-diagnose the problem that way. Others might choose to take a more strongly typed approach to this exception, where they test and discover other potential problems that can happen. What if somebody had a lock on the database? What if a table got deleted? Find the exceptions that are occurring and then create specific catches for those, and then write the appropriate error messages. That would probably be a more production-worthy version of our application if we were to go to that extent. And maybe in future iterations we can debug and test it to the extent that we can find all those very narrowly defined, small likelihood of actually happening type of problems, and then code for them. But in this particular case, we're simply popping up a message box, letting the user know, and hopefully he can diagnose it for himself. Okay, so what is the significance of this? Well, this is one way that I've implemented the strategy for fortifying my code, and it's a fairly straightforward example where we're popping open the message box if there is a problem. Now there's another example if we were to open up the RSS manager.cs, and you can see whenever we're working in this process newsfeed method that I've pretty much encapsulated the entire method in a try catch method. And we talked about the fact that it's probably not a good idea to always do this, that you might encounter some performance hits if you were to do this a lot, and that this was a method that got used very often within the application. However, this particular method works with several unknowns. For example, the internet. What happens when we can't connect to the internet? What happens when there's lost packets that are not delivered through the internet? What happens when we get an XML document that's malformed, or that's not where it used to be. What do? Well, we don't want our application just to blow up as we come across this type of newsfeed that has a problem, or with our own internet connection. We'd like the application to exit gracefully. So when those kind of problems are encountered, what we want to do is handle the problem. Now you can see there's a different strategy in lines 135 through 138 where I'm simply taking whatever exception was delivered to my catch statement and then throwing it up to the code that actually called our process newsfeed method. And why am I doing this? Why didn't I just either display the message box, display the problem in a message box or in a status label? Well, the reason is because, again, I want my RSS Manager class to be fairly autonomous and not be dependent on a specific implementation. If I were to display a message box in this class, I'm tying that implementation to my implementation to a specific type of application, a WinForm application. What if I wanted to use this in another scenario, like for example on a website, or if I wanted to use it on a console application, or in like a Windows service? It wouldn't make sense to pop open a message box. So we don't want to tie the implementation to our class. Instead, I'm going to throw the problem up to the code that called it. So let's go back to our mainform.cs and take a look at the code that actually calls this. And I believe the code that calls it is the query channels method. So let's go ahead and find that in our list. Okay, so you can see here that the query channels, if you recall from our previous discussion, will go through each individual channel for the currently selected folder, or all the folders, I guess. And then for the current channel, it's going to then call our RSS Manager.process newsfeed, passing in the URL for that channel. And so then we begin to go through each individual news item that is retrieved back from that process newsfeed method. So I'm going to use this try catch statement around all of this because again we're working with the database that we may not be able to control whether it's online or not, and so on. And notice here in line 561 where I have this little breakpoint here, we'll turn that off, and that I also have that I'm going to take whatever exception is thrown and then toss it up. So this might have been a little bit of a lazy approach, but ultimately I knew that this query channels would have been called by some other method, that it couldn't just be called by itself. So I'm going to rely on whoever calls this helper method to take care and display the actual problem. So when an exception happens with process newsfeed, it's going to hit this second catch statement, which will take that same exception and then toss it up one more level. Notice also that I have a finally statement implemented, so I'm setting the progress bar back down to 0, and we'll talk about the progress bar implementation in just a minute. But let's take a look at finally in our refresh RSS feed click event that we have the try, and we're calling the query channels method, and then this is where we actually show where the problem was. There was a problem updating the news feed. Again, we're taking the easy route of just using the message property of our exception. Okay, so you can see two different styles of approaches implementing the strategy that we've got for fortifying our code. So let's move on and talk about one other aspect of providing some user feedback. And so for this, let's go back to the add folder helper method that we created. And you'll notice if we revisit lines 176 through 186, that we have this situation where we're adding a new folder row to our data set. Then in line 176, we're calling the update method to take that change, that diffgram, and apply it back into the underlying data store. In other words, to save it back into the rss.mdf file. Okay, and so one of the things that are returned from the update method is the number of rows that are affected. So I'm just going to save those off. As you see here, I've created a integer rows affected, which will give me the number of rows that were affected by the update method. Now, if that is greater than 0, that's good news. That means something actually happened. So we're going to give some non-invasive, non-obtrusive notification to the user that a new folder was created, and then as you can see off to the right-hand side, we're going to actually display the new folder name. And so where is this being displayed? Well, if we take a look at the mainform.cs at the very bottom, you recall in our first snapshot we talked about the status bar, and there's the status, kind of the status bar off to the left-hand side, this progress bar that we'll talk about in just a moment. But next to it, and not really visible, is actually a label that's called status label. And so we will use the status label to update the user on things that we think they should know about, but it's not really super important that we need to interrupt their workflow. So almost all Windows applications have this, right? In fact, if you're looking at the Visual C Sharp 2005 Express Edition, you get these little updates in the lower left-hand corner, which is ready. This changes text as you do different things in the tool. Also, what line you're currently on, the column, what character, and also if you have the insert key on or off and things of that nature. Okay, so you get a little bit of feedback, and that's all we're trying to accomplish here. So just about anywhere where I call this update method, you're going to find me saving off the rows affected and then checking to make sure that something actually happened there. Now, what becomes debatable is if the data was not saved into the database for whatever reason. If the rows affected were equal to 0, then line 185 is going to fire. Why would rows affected equal 0? Well, that would be a scenario where for some reason the row was not saved to the database, but an exception wasn't triggered. Now, why would that happen? I'm not completely sure. I just know in the past that as I've checked rows affected, sometimes that happens. So I don't really need to know that. I just want to prepare for the scenario where it does happen. And so I just basically use the status label, that non-obtrusive approach again. Just tell them that there was a problem creating a new folder, that we couldn't save it into the database, and we leave it at that. Now, some might argue that in a situation like that where the user is expecting to see a folder in the list, it might be too subtle to expect them to take a look in the lower left-hand corner to see that, oh, this operation was not completed correctly. So that's just a design decision that we're going to have to live with. After several users get a chance to work with my application and I get some feedback, some of them are probably going to like it, that I'm not in their face, so to speak, with all these notifications. And some are going to say, hey, it wasn't very obvious to me that why my folder wasn't created. And again, I'm just using this particular example, but it could be applied to any other examples in the source code. So this is just a matter uh, of making a design decision and then suffering the consequences, whether good or bad, as a result of it. Okay. So you might have a different opinion on it, and in future iterations, if you were to take this and continue to work with it, you're free to implement it any way that you want to. So let's continue on. One other thing that I wanted to show you is the use of this expand label. Let's show it in action here. I'm going to run the application quickly. And so now you can see that we have our little preview window populated with the actual web page from the RSS news item that is currently selected. And when I click the expand label, notice that it pops open Internet Explorer with that web page loaded in. Now, how do we make this happen? Well, first of all, what I didn't do, let's go ahead and shut this down. I didn't use the link label from the toolbox, and I think we've already talked about this a little bit, but ultimately decided that the link label here did not allow me to capture a click event, and so I decided instead to use just the label so that I could take more control over how it works. So I simply changed the properties of the label to be blue and underlined to make it look like a hyperlink. And the other thing that I did is that I data bound a certain property of the label that's actually common to most controls, and that is the tag property. Now, the tag property is used for any kind of metadata or user-defined data that is associated with the control but never is displayed. Now, the reason for this is that I need to data bind it much in the same way that I data bind any of these text boxes and then the web browser window as well. So I don't have to write any code that retrieves the data manually from the data set, for example. So I can just data bind this non-visible property called this tag to hold a value, which is the hyperlink for our news item, and then retrieve that tag whenever somebody clicks on our little label here in order to fire off Internet Explorer. So let's take a look at the expand label underscore click event handler. If you take a look in lines 592, I'm simply trying to make sure that something is populated inside of our expand labels tag property. If not, if the length of the string is equal to 0, then we're just going to exit out of this. Okay? Next, we're going to attempt to pop open Internet Explorer by using the system.diagnostics.process class, using the start method, passing in the name of the process we want to start. So iExplore is the process name for Internet Explorer. And then we're also going to pass in as a parameter the tag property of the expand label, which will contain the link. So we're saying open up Internet Explorer and default it to this URL. Okay, so that's what we're doing in line 597. And then if something were to go wrong, we're just simply going to catch the exception, pop open the message box that there was a problem. Okay. Okay, one other thing that I was able to accomplish in this snapshot was the implementation of the progress bar down at the very bottom of our interface. So for example, whenever we click on our refresh RSS feed now, watch in the lower left-hand corner, you can see that the progress bar goes across, and then we get this update in the status label, RSS feeds updated successfully, 44 news items were added. So this gives both a cue to the user that the application is currently busy. This still allows the user to interact with the application. However, it just lets them know that it's currently doing something behind the scenes. And then also we get the RSS feeds updated successfully message to give the user some specific information about how many new items were pulled down. Okay, so now let's take a look through the code a little bit more, and you'll notice that there are, depending on the spot in code, there are sometimes a lot of comments, and in some cases, for example, back in our main form.cs, there are spots where there's not a whole lot of comments. So we might want to take this opportunity to go back through and be a little bit more diligent about finding spots and opportunities to add some comments, and also make sure our naming conventions for our variables and for our objects are correct. Look at line spacing, if there's too many lines or if there's not enough line spacing, to kind of just clean up the code in general and make it more readable. Okay, so let's talk briefly about testing the application. And this isn't really something that's easily demonstrated, but let's talk about some ways that you can test your application and make sure that you have a level of confidence as you give it to other people. Some of the things that you can do to test your application are, for example, to go through each of the various fields. So when you're, for example, adding new channels or editing channels and adding and editing folders as well, you might want to attempt to type too many characters, too few characters. Maybe when we're back here on the main form, we just try to click buttons randomly or in a different sequence than we would normally expect, or that we've normally been clicking the buttons in. Perhaps we give the application to other people and let them try to bang on it for a little bit. Or we try to use the application and turn off the internet. Or maybe try to fill up our hard drive and then run the application and have it attempt to save data into the database. or move the database. Just see how the application reacts whenever we try to do some mean, nasty things to it. These are some of the best ways to test your application. Ultimately, however, whenever you let other people use the application, you're going to find the most feedback about how it performs on various operating systems and things of that nature. So that's when really, as the old saying goes, the rubber meets the road. But try to find as many friends as possible who will let you install it on their computer. People who are running Windows 98, people who are running Windows XP, who are running Windows 2000, who are running a tablet PC. Just try to test the application on as many different platforms as humanly possible, and also solicit their feedback or release a beta version out for free to the general public and allow them to give you feedback. You'll get some harsh comments, but oftentimes you'll get some good comments from people who want to see the development of your application go further so that it's of more utility to them. So now let's talk about how to distribute your application to others. So to install your application on somebody else's machine, you're going to want to create an installation program or an install routine. So typically you'll want to deploy the application on a CD-ROM or over the internet. And so we have the option of how we want to distribute the application using Visual C Sharp 2005 Express Edition, as we'll see in just a moment. But we'll also get the options of what other files to include, dependencies like databases or any artwork, bitmap, GIF files, and so on. And so let's go ahead and get started doing that by right-clicking and selecting Properties from the Solution Explorer. And then it gives us a series of tabs that allow us to view the properties for our project. We're interested in the last tab at the very bottom called Publish. This will allow us to define where we want to publish our application to and also set some other important information. So let me just move this over a little bit here. Now in our simple scenario, we're going to use the Publish Wizard in just a moment. And the Publish Wizard button, as you can see, is down near the lower right-hand corner. However, we can also essentially do everything that the Publish Wizard does and more by working straight from this Properties window. For example, I can select where I want to publish the application. Currently, it's going to attempt to publish it to the local host, so the local web server on this computer, in a folder called RSS Reader. However, by selecting the ellipsis buttons off to the right hand side, I can choose whether I want to install to the file system, to an FTP site, or to a remote site using HTTP, or just a local installation of Internet Information Services. We're going to select our desktop for the time being as the place where we're going to install the files. Additionally, I can select whether I want to make this application available to users only when they're online, so they have to navigate to a web page and run the application from a web page, or whether they can work with the application offline. So what's the benefit of the first option? The application is available only online. Well, this makes sure that they always have the most up-to-date version of your application, which can cure a lot of headaches in terms of supporting your application. If your application requires changes often, then this might be a good option for you. Also, if you want to restrict who can access the application, that might be another reason why you'd want to install it on a web server and make it available only online. However, in our case, we want it to be available offline, available from the Start menu, as it says. Additionally, we can choose to add additional files, for example, any resource files, configuration files, artwork, as we noted before, databases that are external to our application, but our application relies on to run. Um, and we can also set things like how the application gets updated, whether it should check a certain directory on the internet for newer versions so that it can download them. Also, we can set other information about um, the name of our company, the product name, the support URL, and so on, and this will get displayed to the user as they're attempting to install this .NET application on their computer to give them some level of confidence that they're installing the application that they did indeed intend to install. and you have some other options as well, as you can see, for deploying to a web server and to a CD and so on. Additionally, at the bottom you see this ability to add versions to your code that will increment automatically each time you publish, and versions are meant to just let the user know which version of code base that they're working with currently. So as a support professional, you might ask, what version of the application are you currently working with? The user would then be able to look at a help screen or some configuration file that would tell them which version of the application they're working with, and that might help the support individual determine what the exact nature of the problem is, because it's perhaps a known problem in certain versions of the code base. So let's just go ahead and click the Publish Wizard button for now. We've already selected the location we wish to publish to. This allows us to select how the users will install the application, whether from a website, from a network path, a UNC path, or file share, or finally from a CD-ROM or DVD-ROM. So I'm going to select for now the CD-ROM, DVD-ROM option, and we will then burn these files to disk and distribute them to our friends that way. Click the Next button. It asks us if we want to enable the application check for updates on its own. That's a little bit more advanced functionality that I'm not going to enable in this iteration, so we're going to leave the default selection. The application will not check for updates. And we're ready to publish. I'm going to click the Finish button. As you can see in the lower left-hand side of the screen now that the build is in progress, that it's publishing our application, and that it was successful. It opens up automatically the folder where these applications have been installed. It's been installed to our desktop, so if we were to just close this down and minimize this, we can see now there are a series of folders that I'm going to drag into place over here, and files that comprise our application. So we could take these files and burn them onto a CD or DVD using any software such as Nero or software that is available from Microsoft to do the same thing. But what we're going to do is just test our installation by double-clicking the setup.exe. Okay, so we're given an application install security warning. We could avoid this type of warning if we were to include a security certificate in our application when deploying it. Again, a little bit of an advanced topic, so we're not going to go into that right now. Click the install button, and it looks like everything installed successfully. And it automatically pops open our application for us to play around with. So it looks like we have a successful installation of our application. Now all we need to do is just take these files and either put them on a network drive or burn them to a CD. Okay, so we've come to the end of our 16-lesson series on developing applications using Visual C# 2005 Express Edition. We started out by building Hello World applications, and now we're building applications that go on the internet, can grab down XML, can parse it, save it in a database, display it on screen. We've created an install application. We've talked about so many issues between here and there. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this process, and I want to congratulate you for sticking with this, listening to me talk for the last 8 hours, but also hopefully following along and learning these things in a very visual way. So just one last plug. Please come by learnvisualstudio.net so that you can download more videos. But also on a personal note, I just want to wish you success and the best of luck as you continue to develop applications with C#. Thank you.